Hi, I'm Cherie Strachan from the Political Science Department, and I've been asked to share a few of my thoughts about why I think public service is patriotic. So I'm going to share some information about political theory, the founding, a little bit about political history, things that I talk about when I teach my Intro to Political Behavior class, and hopefully by the end of my little conversation, you'll agree with me that public service is probably the only reason why we are able to sustain a democracy. So the first thing I need to convince you of is that democracy is far more fragile than we typically think that it is. After the Constitutional Convention, a woman rushed up to Benjamin Franklin and she asked him whether or not we had a republic or a monarchy. And his now famous reply was, "It's a republic if you can keep it." And this was well within the keeping of the political thought at the time. The founders all knew history. They all knew that democracies tend to burn bright and fast, and that most of them were fragile and failed. There was an image of a sun in the chairs that they sat on. If you go to Constitution Hall, you'll see them. And the big joke at the Constitutional Convention was whether or not that sun was rising on a long-lived republic or whether it was setting on a quickly failed democratic experiment. And it's sort of ironic that democracy is so important to us because it preserves individual liberty, right? Americans value our inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we value this probably more radically than any other country around the globe. And we see this resonating through all sorts of American history. Give me liberty or give me death. No taxation without representation. Susan B. Anthony was a suffragist who was arguing for women's right to vote and encouraging other women to resist not having a voice and having a say in their government. Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. And so we understand that democracy is the only way to preserve individual liberty. And yet our commitment to individual liberty, if we take it too far, is actually the thing that may well undo our democracy and part of the reason why it's so fragile. If we insist on being entirely left alone and entirely free to do our own thing without considering our civic duty and our civic obligations, our democracy will actually fail. So why do democracies fail? So let's take a step back and think about why democracies actually fail. Democracies fail, like other governments, when they are perceived to be corrupt and illegitimate. But the embrace of popular sovereignty, which came out of the Enlightenment and which really shaped American political thought and shaped the way we were starting to think about why government should exist at all, affects what we think of as corruption, right? So as we embrace popular sovereignty as the reason why government should exist, it should exist to serve the public, our definition of illegitimacy changes. It's a very different justification than divine right of kings. So under divine right of kings, the king has the right to rule because the king is appointed by God. The king has the right to siphon off our blood, sweat, and tears, our energy, our taxes, and to use them to prop up his own regime and to reward his supporters. We would see that as corrupt, right? We would see someone who's taking things away from us and not supporting our life, our liberty, our happiness, not just his own, right? But our life, our liberty and happiness should be promoted, right? By government. So failure to serve the common good, failure to promote the broader public's interest is now what we think of as corruption and illegitimacy. And if you're not familiar with John Locke, if that's an unfamiliar name, his argument should actually sound familiar because Thomas Jefferson basically had been reading John Locke before he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And John Locke was a political theorist who basically argued that if government doesn't make your life better, right? If government doesn't help everyone get life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, what do the people have the right to do? We have the right to overthrow. We have a right to civil disobedience, civil unrest, and ultimately to revolt if government isn't making all of our lives better. The problem with that is if government becomes illegitimate, we overthrow it. How often is it that a military coup will result in the embrace of democracy and individual liberty? And this is exactly what the Founding Fathers knew. When democratic institutions become perceived as illegitimate, when there's civil unrest, when there's a military coup, there's a lot of fighting and blood in the streets, typically what happens is the military leader steps in and says, well, we'll come back to democratic practices and democratic institutions later, but for now we need peace and we need stability, and there's a curfew, and you can't say negative things about my rule or my government, and when I decide, we'll have another election. And so you wind up propping up a dictatorship and putting a king or an authoritarian back in power. And so how often after a government becomes destabilized that results in a military coup do we wind up reestablishing a democracy? We were lucky that we did it here when we overthrew a king. It doesn't happen very often, almost never. So who's the biggest threat to a democratic government's legitimacy? What do we really have to be concerned about so that we can maintain a stable democratic government? Well, at the time of the founding, we know that Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense, and he argued that tyrants, kings, dictators, and despots were the biggest threat to individual liberty and to democracy, which makes sense at a time when there's he's fomenting support for a revolutionary war. But it also makes sense if you think about the sea change in the shift from divine right of kings to popular sovereignty. Kings, monarchs, dictators are inevitably what we would refer to as a faction, a smaller group of people or a narrower group of interests that siphon off resources from everyone else to benefit either the king or the king's followers, the dictator and the dictator's supporters, and that certainly doesn't serve the broader common good. Well, after we'd had the Articles of Confederation and we'd had Americans practicing democracy for a while, right before the Constitutional Convention, James Madison, right, the father of the Constitution, pointed out that not only are kings and tyrants capable of being a faction, but so are we, right? That it is possible for a group of people who don't represent the entire collective, right? A piece of the public, but not the full public, to capture control of the legislature, and that we could become our own tyrants. We could, a piece of us could step forward and oppress minority rights, or a majority could step forward and oppress a religious minority, or a minority could step forward and oppress, for example, the elite could oppress those who are poor and be, right, oppressing the majority. And so we could actually oppress ourselves, and then government would lose legitimacy. So we're always careful to make sure that government is responding to the broader common good. Alexis de Tocqueville, though, came to the United States in the 1800s. If you haven't heard of Alexis de Tocqueville, he came here in the 1800s and he wrote a book called Democracy in America. After traveling around and observing local governments, state governments, lots of interest as Europe was starting to shift and adopt democratic governments in how to maintain a stable government. And he actually said Americans' embrace of rugged individualism would be our undoing. And he said that Americans tended to embrace rugged individualism to such an extreme, this insistence on that we have the right to be left alone, that he called it self-interest wrongly understood. That a free people can never be entirely free, because if we insist on being left alone and we insist on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we will pull back into our private affairs. We will stop paying attention to civics and politics and government, and we will stop paying attention because we'll be busy with our own lives because we've lived in a stable democracy for so long. And that what would happen would be that a faction would slide in and take control of government because we weren't watching, because we weren't paying attention, because we weren't living up to our civic obligation and our civic duty, and that we would actually be our own undoing. So how do we stay involved, right? And prevent government from becoming corrupt? Because it takes all of us having what some would call civic virtue, a sense of intrinsic civic obligation or civic duty to pay attention to government, to process newspapers, to pay attention to current events, to figure out what problems need to be solved, and to tell government what to do in order to maintain government's legitimacy. If not civic virtue, perhaps what de Tocqueville called self-interest rightly understood. Maybe it's too much to have civic virtue and be perfect all the time. But Tocqueville pointed out that in the United States, that Americans seem to understand that giving of our time and giving of our energy to stay involved and be active and attentive so that we would have stable democracy, so that we would have good communities to live in, right? So that we would have nice neighborhoods and rule of law and all the things that make life worth living, that if we worked to help produce those collectively, right, that we would benefit, and that we were smart enough to see that in the United States, so that we would see public fortune as our own, that we would work for the good of our community and the good of our state and all the collective work that needed to be done, not just from duty or pride, not just because we're supposed to, but because we recognized that it was in our own self-interest, right? So that was self-interest rightly understood. So in order to sustain a democracy, we need public-spirited citizens who have self-interest rightly understood. The thing is, it's really hard to live up to your civic obligation, live up to your civic duty, to give of your free time, to give of your energy, to pay attention to politics, to pay your taxes, if you think that no one else is doing it, right? If you think you're the only one who's going to show up on a Saturday to clean up a river with a local organization, and you're the only one who ever shows up, you'll stop. If you think you're the only one who ever pays your taxes, you'll stop because you feel like a sucker instead of a good citizen. And so Tocqueville pointed out that many Americans had self-interest rightly understood, and we expected other Americans, or thought that other Americans had self-interest rightly understood, so we trusted one another. I'll show up, I'll do my share, you show up, you do your share, and collectively we'll all be good citizens. And it makes sense to make that investment and not pull back into our private lives and to defend just our own selfish private interests, because we're all in it together. And this is why volunteering is so important. When you volunteer, it convinces our fellow Americans that we are public-spirited, that we're willing to show up, and that we're willing to give of our time and our energy to help solve our collective problems. You're physically demonstrating that's who we are as Americans when you show up. In addition, when you show up and you trust other people to show up, it increases our willingness to join civic organizations. Those organizations, voluntary associations that we join because we want to come together to solve public issues, right? Because we want to come together to do good things for our communities. When we join those kinds of organizations, which Tocqueville noted that we had in droves in the United States, and that he referred to those as our schools of democracy, that this is really where we went to learn how to be good citizens, that the experiences that we would have in those organizations would actually bolster our ability to participate in politics, because the skills and the experiences, even though you were volunteering, were transferable to influencing politics. So when you join those kinds of organizations, you gain civic skills, right? You gain the ability to know how to give a speech, know how to run a meeting, know how to take care of a budget for public organizations, all the things that would allow you to also participate in politics. We also gained, when we joined those organizations, civic engagement, that you talk to other people, you pay attention, you're talking about what the issues are and the problems are in your community, and thinking about how to solve them. So you become psychologically engaged with thinking about I'm the kind of person who helps get involved and who helps solve these problems. And then when you belong to those organizations, your name's on a list. When they need people to volunteer, when they need people to vote, when they need people to work as poll workers or whatever public work needs to be done, you regularly get invited back into the process, right? So all of the things then would form this rich, robust network of civic organizations and active citizens that keeps government responsive to us. Right? When government knows that there's this rich network of organized people who have organizations already that exist where they can mobilize and tell government what they want and communicate a message sort of collectively, government knows we're paying attention. Government gets feedback and fine-tunes the policies it puts in place to better meet our needs. It also decreases corruption. Like, just think of it in terms of local politics. If you're a superintendent, would you embezzle money if there's an active PTA? Even if you were the kind of person who was inclined to do something that corrupt, you wouldn't, because you know you're being watched, right? We know that then when people are organized, they serve as the public's watchdog. So having our willingness to join those organizations, which happens because we observe other Americans doing public service and joining those organizations, means that government will be responsive, government will be less corrupt, and that increases government's legitimacy. And that prevents John Locke's, right? John Locke's conclusion that we don't have to revolt, that we don't have to engage in civil disobedience, we don't have to have another revolution, and our democracy can be long-lived and stable because it's legitimate. So I hope I've brought you back full circle and that you'll see that simply by volunteering, by being the kind of person who physically shows other Americans that you're willing to volunteer and you're willing to join organizations and you're willing to have civic duty and self-interest rightly understood, that's what we need to preserve democracy. Thank you.